Leaders March event. A few housekeeping points before we kick off. Please keep yourselves muted so as not to disturb the conversation. This event will be recorded and made accessible on the BYP network site so you can review and share thereafter. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat box, and then I'm going to call on you so you can ask them yourself. This month's topic is, where is your inclusion insight coming from? Quite often, the people who are tasked with improving D&I are typically experts in other areas. It's not your day job, to be frank. Today, we address this by talking to Frank Starling, the CEO and founder of Variety Pack, an organization which specializes in supporting some of the top organizations in Europe and the US to improve their D&I strategy. And we're doing things a little bit differently this week or this month. Instead of a panel, we're having a fireside chat, albeit virtually. Before we begin, let's set the tone. If ever anyone was concerned that the conversation around systemic racism or the need for D&I was tailing off, the recent interview between Meghan Markle, Prince Harry, and Oprah has brought it right back into sharp focus. In many ways, it epitomizes everything we on this webinar are trying to overcome. Let's break it down. We've got an underrepresented individual who joins a long-standing institution. Being her authentic self isn't supported by the culture of that institution. She finds some allyship, but not enough, and not enough at the highest level. She contends with various microaggressions which are not acknowledged and instead shut down, until finally she is forced to take action to protect herself and is blamed for causing the breakdown in relations. The institution, that is the British monarchy, missed an opportunity to include someone different into its inner circle. And in doing so, it failed to show the 2.4 billion people across the 54 countries in the Commonwealth, who are mostly black and brown, that it could accept someone who looked like them into the fold. What would be really ironic is if someone tasked Meghan Markle with fixing inclusion within the British monarchy. This sounds crazy and impractical, but it's typically the approach organizations take when tackling D&I. Frank, I'm sure you've seen this scenario many times over, but before you share your thoughts on this, please just tell us a bit more about who you are, your journey, and why you are so passionate about D&I.
Thanks, Dom Scott. I think the royal family should definitely hire you to be a spokesperson, because how you described the state of play was perfectly placed, and really pleased to be here. Thanks for having me, BYP, Dom Scott. Great to join you this evening. And to your question, my journey and kind of starting in diversity and inclusion and what I do. So I guess I'll start from the beginning. So I grew up in Hackney, east of London, and didn't come from any financial privilege. Single parent household who struggled to, my mum who struggled to bring up 2 kids, and that had a profound impact on me, because at a young age I recognized that I didn't have everything that the other kids had, and at the same time you start to recognize, your racial background. I'm mixed race. I'm both Nigerian and Sri Lankan, and a very small part Dutch as well, in fact. So I was trying to figure myself out. And I think a lot of my journey of belonging and inclusion was really trying to establish, who am I? How do I fit into this great city of London? And as I grew older, I started to recognize
there isn't really a big Nigerian, Sri Lankan, Dutch community specifically. So
yeah, exactly. There's no specific diasporas that speak to all those communities as a conglomerate. So there was a lot of kind of trying to figure myself out. And I think that journey, as well as seeing my mother experience sexism, racism, all sorts of discrimination. She's also experienced domestic abuse, unfortunately. So I think all these things impacted, how I view the world. So even though a lot of my career, as you know, I worked in property for about 10, 11 years. Many of those years I worked with you, Dom. And and then at some point I had a calling. I had to do more.
The frame of reference, when you say you were growing up in Hackney, sort of when roughly, for the audience's sake, was that in the 70s, 60s, 80s?
Yeah, black don't crack, right? So yeah, that was kind of through the 80s and 90s. So I was born in the early 80s, and yeah, through the 90s was kind of the time where I was growing up. So it was a different time, I guess, in Hackney, where it was diverse, but racism, of course, in London was a big problem. Mixed race couples was a big issue. There were many kind of racist headlines or headlines which had this underlying tone of racism, which was embedded in the literature. And I never forget getting on the tube one day and seeing British National Party stickers on the tube, which you'll never see now in 2021. But so that was kind of my upbringing. And I think when I was 8 years old was the first time I was called the N-word by, funny enough, a friend, someone who's no longer my friend. So it gives you this distinct view of the world that, hang on a second, things feel a little bit different.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of us can relate to that message. And I think that had a profound impact on me as I grew through school and getting into work. I got into work at quite an early age because I had to support my mother. And that was kind of my journey of, belonging and inclusion. And that ended up with me feeling that there's more I've got to do here. Yes, in the corporate sector, but also through social mobility. And if I can combine these two worlds, then that ended up being my passion. I just kind of, what do I talk about the most? And it just ended up being this world of diversity.
About your journey then, and the various businesses you've worked for, factoring in what you do now, how much sort of D&I support did you receive and benefit from along the way?
I think it wasn't, in terms of my journey, I don't think it was a conversation which was at the forefront of many organizations that I worked for. Yeah. And that was because we didn't have the prominence that we did of these kind of social movements. For example, if you take the murder of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, as I was coming through, there wasn't really that kind of strong, nuanced conversation. It was more, you're expected to just kind of fit into cultures and get along. So I think I struggled to really consider, how can I bring myself to work? Yeah. What was that journey? I mean, even down to my accent, when I was about 14 years old, I recognized that I had a bit of a kind of an East London accent. It wasn't that distinct, but a few years later, when I was about 16, shortly before I went into full-time work, I thought I've got to work on trying to neutralize my accent, in fact, because maybe people are going to treat me differently. And I don't encourage people to do that, but these are the things that I think are prominent in the workplace today. So
yeah, so for you at that time, given your circumstances, that felt like the right thing to do.
It felt like the wrong thing to do, like not feeling like I could wear hoodies out on the street because I was going to be judged for who I am. And I'm quite tall, I'm 6'7", right? So people are going to look over to me and think, well, this person's probably doing no good. And in fact, I've never been that person. But I kind of went too much the other way, I think, at some point at that early stage, wanting to strip myself of anything which made me, maybe to the masses, to the homogenous cultures we can be part of, sure, maybe stand out.
Sure. So when thinking about your journey, it's clear then that improving D&I would have improved your personal experience. So it makes sense why you're passionate about it. But then what's been the catalyst for you wanting to improve D&I for other people? Because I talk to a lot of people who care about it, but I have to say, no one as much as you.
I think a couple of things. I think I feel fortunate and grateful that I managed to embody this mindset that I can be anyone and do anything in my lifetime, even though I didn't have that financial privilege. My mother, there's only so much my mother could teach me. I followed the route of personal development. I decided to pick up books and do online courses and do everything possible to equip myself with the skills whilst trying to literally form the person I am today. So I felt compelled to share the blueprint. I think what we see all too often is individuals who pull the ladder up, right?
Yeah.
They get to a certain level, they're not willing to share their failures, they're not willing to talk about their successes and how they did it. And that really frustrated me, because in my community, certainly in roughly about 2014, 2015, when I was volunteering with Hackney Council, there was a project there to tackle unemployment with young black men, which at the time was the highest in the UK within my borough. And I just felt so frustrated and disarmed. And I thought, I've got to do something about that. And that kind of was me volunteering, me being a business mentor, trying to mentor some young people. But then I started to think about and consider, what are the structural issues that we're not tackling here? So as much as you've got young people who are trying to come through who may have had a background similar to mine, we also need to tackle what's happening in the workplace, right? Because there lies an opportunity to build equity, to change the very structure of society if we diversify senior leadership, if opportunities are fair, if we create and build a true meritocracy. We don't have a true meritocracy because we don't have a level playing field. So
yeah, I really identify with that. For me, the way I often explain or sort of answer the same question is, being black isn't something I do. It's not something I switch on and off. It's something I am. And if for any reason that's a disadvantage to me, then oddly, it's like I grew up in a generation where I knew the world was a certain way. You put your head down, you get on with it. But since becoming a parent, I don't want that for my children. You know, I want them to be their authentic self and be able to prosper irrespective of the conditions around them. And I suppose the other component to this is, it's quite literally a matter of life and death, where you've got a lack of diversity, for instance, in the managerial structure of the NHS. It leads to policies which then disadvantage black and brown people. We've seen that repeated across a number of different institutions. So for me, it's all about the environment we're creating. If we can't sort of get it right for your generation and my generation, then, you know, as a new parent yourself, I'm sure you can empathize with that more so than you did this time last year.
Yeah. Totally, I totally can empathize with that. And as you say, it wasn't just kind of being a new parent. I've got a 5-week-old who's nestling with his mother somewhere. I think it was also just this realization that if we don't tackle this issue of lack of representation, lack of inclusion, people not feeling like they can bring their whole selves or as much as themselves to work, what society are we creating? You know, we're creating fractures. We're perpetuating discrimination in some way, whether that be across racial lines or gender lines or religion, etc. So that in itself will change the very fabric of society. Who gets opportunities, who can level up in terms of their salary, right? Who can buy a certain type of house, you know, in terms of wealth creation, that entire conversation there. So we have to have the right interventions. I was tired of standing on the sidelines, and I felt that since I'm talking about this a lot, then I've got to do something about it, and I've got to do it in a meaningful way. And that kind of translated into the many hats that I'm wearing today.
Yeah, so the one in particular I'm keen to focus on for our audience, and I think it's potentially most relevant, is Variety Pack. So you are the founder and CEO of this business. I mean, you and I have known each other for a long time. I struggle to get hold of you now. You're busy. You are always working on some project or some initiative. So it's clearly going really well. Talk to us a bit about Variety Pack, the kind of work you're doing, and yeah, anything else you feel relevant.
So I think the purpose of starting Variety Pack, which is a kind of diversity and equity and inclusion consultancy, was to put meaning and authenticity into the work. You know, what I see firsthand and what I've seen, I think, for my entire corporate career is through things. Firstly, it's this fear of discomfort. We really struggle to have the tough conversations. We struggle to talk about what the real issue is, the elephant in the room. And that has created inequality in the workplace. It's perpetuated a lot of these social inequalities that that I kind of mentioned already. I think the second thing I've seen is performative diversity and inclusion, and this is what really gets to me, where we're kicking the can down the road, right? We've got initiatives, we've got strategies, we've got things out there which
that term down, please, Frank, for us. What do you mean by performative?
Yeah, performative essentially is kind of theatrics, right? So we're doing things to make us look good. So as an organization, we might be sponsoring an event, we might be putting a bit of money aside for, some kind of cultural cook-off one weekend, but we're never getting into the nitty-gritty. We're never addressing our lack of representation. We're never trying to build meaningful inclusion. So a lot of our efforts associated with diversity and inclusion end up being performative. So we never kind of get into the real work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it's tokenistic and temporary.
It's tokenistic and, and it's always surface level.
Yeah.
That's the third thing. And I think sorry, that's the second thing. And I think the third challenge is this perception gap, really. And it's the difference between me, let's say, as a senior leader, thinking I'm building an inclusive and empowering work culture versus the actual experience of team members and how that differs. And seeing those things firsthand, experiencing those things firsthand, led me, on top of my own journey of belonging there, led me to form Variety Pack. And our purpose is really to meaning and authenticity into the work. And we do that in various different ways. We work with clients in all sorts of different sectors, in the media, in tech, in finance, in the charity sector as well. And we've got a number of processes, but fundamentally, we're trying to lead to that authentic change, and that's across two different ways. That's firstly, building that awareness, and that's hearts and minds. So how do we change hearts and minds for people to be empathetic to what the real issues are? And then secondly, how do we look at a systems level change? What I mean by systems level change, it's the policies, it's the procedures, it's strategy to make sure that we've got both the moral and the business case which are working together. And that's the focus of Variety Pack as a business.
And does Variety Pack focus on one area of D&I, or are you covering a range of different areas?
So we typically cover a range of different areas, but we take an intersectional approach via the kind of intersectional consultants that I work with. So as much as I'm a founder and CEO, there are certain aspects that I don't necessarily feel comfortable speaking to, and that's where I bring in, my kind of team of consultants who are entirely intersectional. I think that really helps, and that also ensures that we're tackling any echo chambers that we might be in. It's easy for me to just speak from my lived experiences, but it's really important that we have, a broad breadth of perspectives at the table.
Sure. So to go back to the essence then of this session, I'm always conscious of Black network leaders who've been tasked with fixing systemic racism or diversity and inclusion within their organizations. It's not their day job. And hopefully they've listened to what you've had to say so far, and they're thinking, I'd love to get in contact with someone like you, maybe even Variety Pack. How does the process typically start with Variety Pack working with a business? Do you find them, or are they phoning you for support and help?
Yeah, it works both ways. We get a lot of referrals through, luckily, clients speak very highly of us. So we've got people who kind of contact us directly through our website, through me directly via LinkedIn. And then there are times where I reach out to my network. I've got quite a large network as well. So when I put out thought leadership, I write for Forbes in diversity and inclusion. So when I put out a lot of thought leadership and blogs and things like that, people also get in touch because they're interested to know about our approach and how we work with businesses. And that very first stage is really going on this discovery tour. Let's try to find out where we are at the moment. Let's take a pulse of the organization and let's get some quantitative and qualitative insights of what inclusion means for the people in that organization. And that's kind of our very first step in terms of how we work.
So who are you talking to at that point? Will it be, for instance, the head of the Black network within the organization, or maybe the head of the women's network, or the LGBTQ plus one? Is it the CEO? Who does it tend to be?
It tends to be the chief people officer or the chief operation officer who kind of brings us in and engages with us directly. At times we may have a champion, so as you say, a network leader who reaches out to me to say, you know, we're doing this piece of work, can Variety Pack support us? Or, you know, we're planning this project, are we doing it in the right way? And then from that point, I will have a meeting typically with the kind of the C-suite in any organization to understand, you know, are we serious about this, right? You know, is this just a kind of a performative project, or are we willing to take a deep dive, ask for the 360 feedback, have the tough conversations in safe spaces? And that's kind of typically how we get going. Because for me, that authentic approach has got to be there from the start. It's all well and good delivering a bit of work, but what else is happening? Because our people that are working around us in the companies that we work for, they're expecting change. And in fact, it's got to the point where they're demanding change. So, you know, diversity and inclusion shouldn't be taken lightly. It's got to be part of that strategy. And as I engage with organizations, you know, I personally need to know that, you know, that is the case.
I mean, having worked with as many businesses as you have done, I imagine you've built up a sixth sense for companies who are being performative and companies who are being sincere. What are the signs typically you tend to find, and how do you then react when you're engaging with someone who clearly doesn't really care?
Yeah, I think the first kind of red light, if you will, is when a company believes that everything's fine because they've got a friendly culture, and you know, they offer incentives, and when we could go out, they'd have drinks on a Friday, and it feels like a family. And that may sound great on a surface level, but as we kind of lift up the rug, as we go beneath the surface, 9 times out of 10, we're going to see feedback and data insights that paints an entirely different picture. So I think for us, it's, you know, we always take a kind of cautionary step forward when we're working with any organizations that have a friendly and fun culture. I think if it's a slightly kind of older and more kind of established business with very old protocols, we can kind of expect that maybe they aren't as progressive and as forward thinking as maybe they need to be in 2021. So, you know, that kind of leads to what kinds of questions are we going to ask on that discovery tour, on that kind of first survey. So I think that's the first indicator. I think another indicator is how seriously the executive team take diversity and inclusion. Can they articulate what their blind spots are? You know, do they understand the definition of unearned privilege? Can they describe to me how unconscious bias plays out within their organization? If these questions are really hard to answer, then for me, maybe the work that's been done so far has been good. It's probably led to some sort of inroads, but we've got to take a deeper dive.
Sure. And do you often come across people who get quite defensive? Is that common?
I do in all the time. I think I'm proud myself on creating safe spaces, and I meet people where they are. So I never kind of shock the system straight away. I build that trust and build that relationship, and then at some point, I think we kind of lead to the tougher questions. But I think anytime I talk about things like privilege, or if I'm having a deeper conversation on race or gender identity, all these things that can be considered to be controversial in a work setting, people can have their backs against the wall because they feel like this is questioning my morals, this is questioning whether I'm a good person, when in actual fact, what we're trying to do is allow people to speak their truths. That should be a fundamental right, I think, of every single person in the workplace today. So it's really important in that instance that we kind of dismantle our egos, right? We remember that the work is more important than, you know, whether we consider ourselves to be good people or not. That's not what's in discussion here. What's in discussion is whether we are creating equality of opportunity, equity for diverse communities, work cultures which are empowering, that allow people to, you know, like I say, kind of bring as much as themselves to work as they feel comfortable doing.
Sure. I've got a few comments here in the chat. Beverly picked up on your earlier comments of we all tend to unfortunately put on a workplace persona to accommodate the environment we operate in. And I'm sure a lot of people will identify with that. We've also got a question from Jane. Jane, if you're able to, please ask your question yourself. I'll give you 10 seconds, Jane. Otherwise, I will ask it for you.
She dropped it in and then switched on EastEnders, I think. So,
well, one week we had someone on the bus who was typing but couldn't actually speak. So I'm going to ask your question, Jane. So, hi, our current BAME network leaders don't get paid or get full recognition. What's your advice to raise that first before bringing someone in? Is that necessary? Is that a good idea to do so?
I think it is a good idea. I think we want to remunerate our network leaders because often, more often than not, what I see is network leaders or affinity group leaders who are speaking about their own intersections, right? So let's say I'm part of a Black network and I'm trying to speak to the issues of the Black community, or I'm trying to kind of come up with solutions within my organization. That work can be very triggering. So on top of my day job, I've also got to do this. I'm doing it because I'm passionate. I'm doing it because I want to create change. But I think on an organizational level, we need to respect and acknowledge that it is tough. It is a difficult process to do that. So I think it's a positive thing to reach out to your HR director, your chief people officer, maybe as a conglomerate with other network leaders, and consider whether that is something that you can table, whether the organization would consider that, because I think it's very fair, because that also then gives you some time every week where you can allocate enough of a kind of a diary block to get through these tasks, as opposed to 7 o'clock in the evening you're trying to dive into content which can be quite tough to kind of orchestrate at times.
Sure. Jane, I hope that answers your question. Frank, I'm really keen to get an idea as to what good looks like. What does good D&I within an organization look like? And as a part of that answer, what does good allyship look like as well?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. It really depends on the organization. It depends on where they are on their journey. Depends on the size of the organization, and it depends on the resources that they have at their disposal. I think overall, what we're trying to see is, firstly, the people that work with us have this sense of inclusion, and inclusion I define as, you are acknowledged for who you are, your cultural background. You feel like you're part of the group. You feel like your efforts are acknowledged. The culture is trying to empower you, so there aren't sticky floors and glass ceilings. There aren't limitations to what you can achieve. These, I think, are the kind of the tenets and pillars of inclusion. I think with diversity, what we're trying to see is a critical mass. As we know, many organizations, let's say in the UK, certainly in the US as well, lack representation at senior leadership level, and that's not okay. We need to change that. So if that isn't present, it isn't about going on a kind of a drive to just try and hire as many Black and brown folk as possible. That is, of course, incredibly important. But at the same time, we've got to think about, when we bring these folks in, do they have an environment that allows them to thrive? So we kind of need to work on both spheres at the same time. So success can look very different depending on where an organization is on their journey, how much of this work they've done already, and also how serious they're taking it. When you've got companies like Niantic that's putting tens of millions of dollars towards building equity in the Black gamers community, okay, that's what we want to see, right? That's the kind of initiative and strategy that we need. So we're not just working internally, we're also thinking about how can we share the gains and share the blueprint and really lift up the communities that we're trying to serve beyond what we're doing internally. And I think the most kind of forward-thinking organizations out there, They're willing to have the tough conversations. They're willing to have the uncomfortable conversations. And I think that's the first thing that organizations should be doing. They should be acknowledging what people actually
foundation
require.
that kicks off a lot of other activity. Without that, I presume it's really difficult to get anything else started. It's a really comprehensive answer to quite a tough question in many regards. It's almost like how long is a piece of string? As you were talking, a few questions came in on the chat. Kenneth, if you're able to, please ask your question. Got Kenneth's iPhone.
Hello?
Kenneth, hello, we can hear you.
Sorry, right, yeah, I'm gonna have to just go back to the question to read what it what it was.
It's about BAME being lumped in.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts on BAME being lumped into or considered part of a company equality, diversity and inclusion network? Do you think this somewhat puts all of the struggles on an equal playing field?
So I understand, Kenneth, when you say BAME, do you mean all these kind of different ethnicities and races kind of being put together? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, so I think in terms of you might include accessibility under equality, diversity and inclusion, LGBTQ, mental health, like they all kind of get lumped into, well, speaking for my company, they all get lumped into equality, diversity and inclusion.
Well, I think ultimately there's a couple of different ways to look at this, because you've got the equality, diversity and inclusion policy that any company has, and that's kind of this 5-page document which is tucked away on the intranet somewhere and speaks a little bit about diversity. And then we've got this work of diversity and inclusion where we are trying to empower different groups based on their lived experiences. So I think we should always give respect to the many categories of diversity that exist. So that's across racial lines, gender lines, religion, socioeconomic diversity, neurodiversity. There's many different categories there to speak of. And we've got to ask ourselves, why are we doing this? What is the purpose? So if we just create an affinity group, or we create an employee resource group, why are we doing it because another organization within our sector is doing it, or are we doing it because we want to empower people to have a voice and feel like they're part of this organization, they're empowered to be the best version of themselves? So I think we should always kind of bring it back to that question and not just do things because it seems like the right thing to do. Because what I've seen time and time again, certainly with growing organizations, is they put together this really kind of detailed and glossy PDF of a diversity and inclusion strategy. And after 2-3 years of actually looking back and considering what impact have we made, the majority of the time, I think they've struggled to follow through on the promises of that strategy. So I think simplifying the approach is really important. I think how you tackle it is really dependent on what do people expect. How can we co-create our definition of inclusion by listening to people, by asking questions and finding out what they define as inclusion and what they feel are barriers that exist for them, based on their lived experiences.
Thanks for that, Frank. As you were talking, it got me thinking about a question I often have people ask me within the mortgage sector, which is, if you're a London-based firm, you've got an environment which is ethnically diverse. But if you're based in certain other parts of the UK, then you don't have that same level of diversity. So how are you able to then create that diversity within an organization if you just don't have people of a certain type typically living geographically in that area?
It's a great question. It's topical now as well. London is 40% black and brown, kind of minority ethnic, or BAME, as if you will. So we've got that diversity present. Excuse me. I think if you are in other geographical hubs at the moment, because of COVID, there is no excuse for it, isn't there? Because I think a lot has changed. We've moved into remote and hybrid ways of working. I think obviously for some organizations that may not be possible, because the type of role that you have may be based at a manufacturing plant, let's say in a particular location. How do you then find diversity if they're not present, if they're not present within that community? And I think that's tricky unless people are willing to move. But certainly within, our capital cities, if we go back to our old way of working, of just going to the office, then I think you've got to look harder. You've got to think about where you're promoting your jobs and which communities you're connected to. Like the BYP is obviously a fantastic resource and a fantastic community to ensure that your applications that you're putting out there, your job descriptions are going out to a diverse community. So I think ultimately it's removing the excuses, because a lot of the time we say that the pipeline isn't there, that these people just aren't present.
Yeah.
But as we know, our job descriptions can be intentionally racist, right? We can have things in there which just exclude people by design. So I think that's the first question we need to ask is, do we have adverts that we're putting out there which are excluding as opposed to including? And also, do we have gatekeepers in an organization that are stopping people from diverse backgrounds joining a company? And we experience that all the time. If we've got a name which doesn't sound like it's from a particular country, for example, you've got people who are losing out on the opportunity just to interview on the basis of that. So many different ways to look at it, but I think it's kind of asking yourself, are you doing enough? Is there more that you can do? And if there is, how can you either work with your diversity and inclusion lead to figure out a better strategy, or obviously bringing the right expertise to change that?
Great, thank you. Right, let's get down to the nitty gritty. You, in some way, shape or form, are now working with an organization. Either you found them or they've found you. You've had the conversations with the chief people officer and the CFO and COO and various other key individuals, and they now want you to add value to their business. What ways have you typically added value to the organizations you've come into contact with?
Yeah, it's a great question. In many different ways, really. I think, firstly, it's kind of uncovering blind spots. I think any business should have a good understanding of who their people are, what their people represent, and what they need from the organization. And far too often, I think that's lacking. And what usually happens is an organization tries to grow, and these blind spots just get worse, to the point where you've got someone that leaves because they've had a negative experience.
Sorry to cut you. Just explain what you mean by blind spot.
So what I mean by that is areas of the business that we may just not be aware of happening. So, for example, take something like microaggressions, unintentional discrimination. Our organization may be rife with microaggressions, but there's no education around it. We're not doing anything about it. We're not even acknowledging that microaggressions exist. Therefore, it continues to decay and fester within a work culture. And what we typically do is we try to seek and find where these issues may be apparent, and that in itself adds value, because we then know what interventions do we need to focus on.
How do you do that?
To
because
change that.
If the senior people you're talking to aren't aware of these things, and I'm sure they want to put themselves across in the best light possible, when you then speak to the junior people, I'm presuming sometimes people don't want to get into trouble. They don't want to be recorded and don't want their name on the record. So how do you get the real picture of what's going on?
Yeah, so many different things are kind of involved in that discovery stage. So firstly, it will be talking to, I will have one-on-one conversations with all of the C-suite, so the entire kind of senior leadership ranks there, because I'm trying to identify where they feel they've got blind spots in a safe space, and we can just have an open conversation around that. We conduct focus groups, and that's really important because that gives an opportunity for people to just share their views. I held a focus group earlier today, and the topic was tackling racism and inequality. And how
many people were in the group?
So there typically is always a maximum of around 12 to 15. So there was 11 people in this group, and they
sorry, was it a cross section of different levels of seniority, or all on one level?
Yeah, so there's a cross section of seniority. You had anyone from junior managers to directors in this group, and it was a cross section of racial groups as well. So it's a kind of an entirely mixed group, and in that group you had people sharing their experiences of racism, both in the workplace and outside of the workplace. And that, again, that gives us a really clear indication of some of the blind spots, because you've got some things that people have never shared for years, let's say, which they share within that focus group. So it's really powerful, in fact. And
have there ever been any revelations, anything which makes you go, okay, that's maybe a bit too much information? What's the most surprising thing you've heard?
I think
without giving names away, of course.
Yeah, no, the most surprising thing is one particular individual who had a very kind of negative experience of racism from their line manager, and never felt confident enough to share it, and kind of bottled it in for 2-3 years, and was kind of in tears when they were sharing the story. Yeah. So, and I think many of us can resonate with experiences we may have had which are similar to that. So that's always an eye opener, because there we've got a company which maybe has a fun culture, but actually behind the scenes there's work to be done. So focus groups are really important. We also design surveys. So off the back of some of the work we've done in those kind of one-on-one conversations, in those group conversations, we design a survey which is specific to that organization that we launch. And in that survey, we're going to ask a combination of questions that we feel will give us a good indication of how inclusive they are, what blind spots the organization may have.
What platform do you use to conduct these surveys? Are they things our Black network leaders could do for themselves if they needed to, or?
So I think most companies will have a kind of an internal workplace kind of survey platform, let's say Peakon or CultureAmp, etc. We use a combination of either an internal tool from an organization, or we may use something like Typeform, for example, which is kind of an off-the-shelf platform that you can use to design and launch a survey.
And are they anonymous surveys?
They can be anonymous. It really depends on the question you ask. So I think if you're not asking for that specific information, people will just be provided a link, and the survey will be anonymous. All of our surveys are anonymous, because for obvious reasons we're asking for.
I'm really keen for people to get a sense of what good looks like, because I'm sure for people that don't have experience in this, they want 100%, but I imagine that's quite rare as a response rate to a survey.
It is quite rare. I think of a survey of this nature, which is not about employee performance, it's about diversity and inclusion. I think you always want to reach that critical mass of at least 50% of the wider population. I think any higher than that is obviously fantastic. I mean, typically we may get response rates of 80-90% if the leadership is really bought in, if it's been sold correctly in terms of you have a voice and it's entirely anonymous. So I think it really depends on the mechanics of the organization and how they've run surveys in the past, and also the trust that employees have in, let's say, the HR department, because usually there's issues there, there's challenges where as an employee, I don't necessarily entirely trust my HR department because the right mechanisms are not in place, or maybe I've shared an experience in the past and it's not really been acknowledged, it's been shut down, which can happen in any company. But obviously that's kind of where we can add value, because we're independent.
The irony there, the very thing you're trying to solve is what becomes a challenge in identifying the problems. So what other things do you do in that observation phase? Are they the key ones? I've got focus groups, meetings with senior management to identify blind spots. I've got surveys. Is there anything else before we move on?
Yeah, so we also conduct safe space discussions, and these are kind of open sessions for people to drop in and kind of talk to me actually directly and share their perspectives. And that is, again, just a chance for any person in the organization, irrespective of where they are, to have a chat with, a D&I professional, so they can get some insight, but more importantly, they can share some of their views and perspectives, or maybe there's some struggles. Maybe they've experienced microaggressions. They don't want to put it in the survey. They want to kind of talk about what they feel is important for them. And that, again, incredibly powerful way to get a good understanding of where an organization is.
When I'm thinking of this, I'm thinking of people who are the recipients of microaggressions, but how often do you get people who are the ones, being racist or being misogynist or being homophobic in some way, shape or form? How often does someone put their hand up and say, I've got this wrong?
Yeah, so I had that a couple of months ago actually on a focus group. It was a mixed focus group, and at the start we had everyone kind of introduce themselves and talk about their understanding of racism, and at the end of the focus group you had an individual who was a white ally who just said, actually, look, I'm reflecting now, and I think there'd be instances here where my language maybe wasn't as appropriate as it should have been. And it's important to understand that racism is on a spectrum. It isn't confined to the most insidious events in society. It isn't confined to, the murders of the likes of George Floyd, Trayvon Martin. It can happen in those unintentional moments, right? So when we make statements like we're not racist, it clouds what racism actually is. Microaggressions, unintentional discrimination, they're slights and snubs and remarks that can be said in jest, that can be said in an unconsciously kind of biased way. But it doesn't mean that they're not rooted in some sort of discrimination. I think it's really important that we acknowledge that when we're talking about these issues.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by that, because I often find where I've had conversations with people on this, it's hard for individuals to address it without going all the way back into their childhood and raising some questions about the relationship they had with their parents, their teachers, their friends. If they've got a certain view of the world now, chances are they didn't wake up this morning with that view. It's been nurtured and crafted over a period of time. And if they see a different way of thinking, you don't just change that way of thinking in a heartbeat. It's quite overwhelming to think, I've got this wrong for 40 years. I need to now make some fundamental changes.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in that. I mean, firstly, our ego is always there as a layer to kind of protect ourselves. It becomes a bit of a facade. So anytime we're challenged on a lived experience that we don't truly understand, that's when our defenses go up and we say, I'm not a racist, or I'm not sexist, or I'm not homophobic, or whatever the case may be. But I think when we're challenged, that is an opportunity to learn. That is an opportunity to grow. So I think humility is incredibly important, because if we can't, unless you can articulate what it is to be a Black woman with a visible faith group, a person with a physical disability, a person who identifies as LGBTQ plus, who's going through a transition, unless you can articulate these things, it's very likely that you will have blind spots, and therefore those blind spots could be perpetuated in some sort of unintentional bias, right? And that can impact the decisions you make, how you view people, how you communicate and engage with the communities around you, what you say, your general beliefs. So unwinding a lot of the social norms that you've kind of led to believe is difficult. And we're not, I don't think the work of diversity and inclusion is trying to convert anyone's opinion. What we're trying to do is build work environments that just respect people for who they are. They're empathetic and understanding of the different cultures that are out there. Some of us out there are progressive liberals, some of us are far more conservative, and maybe we won't meet in the middle in terms of our views, but at very least we should always respect and acknowledge our views. And I think that typically doesn't happen often enough when there are disagreements at play.
Okay, so we're past the observation stage now. You've collated all the information you need from the focus groups and the one-on-ones and the surveys. What's next?
Yeah, so the next stage is where we kind of focus on the interventions, and those interventions are going to be across a number of different categories. So that could be training, that could be coaching, that could be building content, that could be delivering kind of one-on-one executive sessions. So there's a entire toolkit of things that we look at to work with companies to actually progress them forward on the narratives of diversity and inclusion. So
I'll be a bit facetious now, because there'll be someone thinking this. If your observations have highlighted someone maybe senior within a business who's racist, how are you going to come into that business and train them not to be a racist? Am I being too reductive?
Not at all. I think if clear and apparent toxicity exists within individuals, then the business has got to ask themselves whether they're going to take a stance on that first and foremost. So that organization's got to say, we are taking zero tolerance on X. And that kind of sets the scene of what we expect going forward. You know, we've gone through this discovery tour. We have a comprehensive report from Variety Pack. Going forward, we're now going to commit to change. So that in itself, I think, is an opportunity to just let anyone know that is consciously perpetuating discrimination. That's obviously very different from unconscious discrimination. If you're consciously kind of you know, racist or sexist, etc., then you would expect the business to kind of work out that individual at some point.
Yeah,
in fact,
I mean, dare I say it, I would almost want someone to be made an example of, because it sets the tone that there's a zero tolerance approach to that kind of behavior.
Well, we've seen that with many kind of high profile CEOs that may have been ousted, and it's tend to kind of, you know, it's led to an organization losing close to £3 billion on the stock market. So I think a lot of those scalps are found in the process, and it's clearly not acceptable to promote the values of toxicity. You know, toxic workplace culture is costing UK businesses over £15 billion a year. So it makes sense to take a zero tolerance and just discrimination as a whole. So,
and just to maybe sort of challenge that, play devil's advocate to my own point, is this different to cancel culture? If someone says the wrong thing once, are we talking about the same thing, or should someone be given a chance to get it right and learn from their mistakes? How do you reconcile those two points?
Well, it goes back to your earlier point of, if you built up this view of the world over several decades or even a decade of your lifetime, it's incredibly difficult to unwind and unravel all of that stuff over the course of 2 months or doing a bit of training on diversity and inclusion. You know, even just this idea, this notion of being a better ally, that is a lifelong process of building relationships. So I think what we should do is allow a space for people to get it wrong, but at the same time, we need to remove this expectation of we expect people of a particular culture to advocate for themselves. You know, just like, for example, if we're trying to dismantle racism, you know, it's not the responsibility of Black folks out there to dismantle racism, even though we're passionate about it, even though we talk about it all the time, even though we've got the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, it's the responsibility of the individuals who are perpetuating racism to stop it, you know, to kill it dead. So, so it's, again, it's a complex task, but I think cancel culture is saying that, you know, your opinion isn't valid, and I think it's really important to allow people to share their views, even if they're controversial. When they get too far, when they're rooted in conscious discrimination, I think that's where we have to kind of call it a day and really kind of look at how, you know, the severity of the issues and reporting, obviously, when that is witnessed.
Great, that's a really comprehensive answer, and I'm just conscious I keep taking you off on tangents from this main thread here. Really interesting content. So again, you're working with an organization, you've gone through the observational stage, and then you're doing interventions, and you're about to go through some other areas of interventions. And then I'm keen just to understand sort of how you finish a project. I'm conscious of time. We've got another sort of 5 to 10 minutes or so. So let's cover that, and then maybe we can have time for 1 or 2 questions as well from the audience.
So yeah, what we're typically going to do at this, after kind of a round of interventions, we're going to take another pulse. So we're going to deploy another survey. We're going to go through another round of having conversations to understand, have we moved forward in what we're doing, right? So before we start to strategize and build this kind of robust D&I strategy, you know, do people feel empowered? Do they feel more empowered and more equipped with the right tools to build inclusion? And that's kind of the next stage before we then start to craft a deeper a more complicated diversity and inclusion strategy where we look at all the different strands. We're going to look at policies, we're going to look at procedures, we're going to look at, do we have the right reporting mechanisms in place? You know, how are we reaching out to underrepresented groups? You know, what is our strategy to diversify senior leadership? And that's where it becomes a little bit more complex, where we're going to have objectives and key results at hand. And we're building into this phase of accountability, you know, where, great, we've done some discovery work. We've had a bit of interventions to kind of build awareness to that hearts and minds piece. And now we're going to take an even deeper dive into a systems level change where we're trying to build or inclusion, which lasts essentially, because it's a moving target. It changes all the time. So it's really important that we're kind of measuring that progress in that way. But caveat to that is moving away from this narrative that we need data to prove civility and human decency. That's a really dangerous conversation to have. You know, fundamentally, discrimination shouldn't exist in 2021. It does. And we've come up with this thing, diversity and inclusion, as some sort of solution. It doesn't completely solve the problem. It does in a very small way. But it's really important that, you know, that accountability is there, that follow through is there, and that organizations take this process incredibly seriously.
Yeah, that's a really interesting concept, and not one when you've got 2 minutes left, but it's this difference between racism and diversity and inclusion. And the way I sort of broadly distinguish the two is racism is about whether someone recognizes me as a human being, because the ultimate end of racism is dehumanization, whereas D&I is about recognizing the different types of human being, because there's many different ways to be a human being. And quite often firms, I find, are trying to tackle racism through D&I, but actually there's a clear distinction between the two.
It's two separate issues. And then we've got that equity conversation, right? If racism has existed for a period of time where it has disabled, you know, it's kind of removed opportunities for a certain group, how are we changing that through an equitable approach to our business growth and innovation, which again, probably not enough time to dive into that conversation today, to be honest. That's at least half an hour. But if you're going to acknowledge racism, if you're going to do some great diversity and inclusion work, how are we ensuring that people also have a seat at the table and something to eat at the same time? Because that is as important as those first two things.
Brilliant. Final question. Gori, if I'm pronouncing that right, has put a question on the chat. Would you like to ask that question as our final one for today?
Yeah, completely. And great session, Frank. Hopefully, sorry for the background noise. It really was a question around the balance that organizations are trying to, I guess, find with equity-focused support. So it could be learning, it could be training, it could be, again, like you mentioned, how do they invest in those individuals to help them progress through an ERG, for example, versus the reform that might need to happen at senior leadership level, for example. So how do they balance that out? And what are you finding in your work where organizations are focused on or investing in and trying to get that balance right?
Great question. Shout out to Gori, Upskill Digital there. And yeah, I think it's a great question, Gori. I think ultimately what we need is these things to work in tandem, because executive teams should not be blockers to the work of diversity and inclusion. And far too often we see that happen, where D&I is not necessarily, diversity and inclusion isn't necessarily on the board agenda. So we pass it down to some senior managers to kind of invoke some sort of interventions. And I think that's really important, because we want our team to be going on a learning journey. We want them to develop and progress their narrative around inclusion. But at the same time, we've got to ensure that, our senior leaders are building their understanding of the importance of this work. There's a great report from Accenture called the Getting to Equal Research Report, and it in much detail, it explains the difference between leaders thinking they're creating an empowering organization versus the actual experience of team members. And it's that kind of perception gap that we've got to close simultaneously whilst taking our teams on a journey. And at some point, you're going to have to prioritize. But I think companies, if they've got a dwindling resource, they've got to ask themselves a question of, where is inclusion going in the years to come? Quite frankly, it's not going anywhere. It is the future of work. So we've got to accept that diversity and inclusion has to be a central pillar. And at the same time, it can be something that organizations are leveraging in what is, I think, one of the kind of most volatile markets we've seen in many years.
Frank, thank you so much for your time. I knew this was going to happen. We've got more wisdom to share than time to share it with. I've known you for a very long time, but I learn something every time I talk to you, which is you know, I'm really grateful for the opportunity for that to happen. Looking at the chat, a lot of people agree with me. I think you've given our Black network leaders a lot to go away and think about and empower their own individual journeys within their organizations. Are you happy for people to contact you on LinkedIn? I saw a question, for instance, from Asher and a few other comments. Are you happy for people to engage with you, maybe get the resources and answers they need?
Definitely, yeah. So I'm Frank Starling on LinkedIn and Frank R. Starling on Twitter. So feel free to reach out to me there.
Brilliant. Well, that's it from us for this week. Again, if anyone has any questions, then feel free to contact Frank on LinkedIn. You can contact myself on LinkedIn as well, and we'll do our best to come back to you in good time. Thank you, audience, for taking the time to listen to us today. I know everyone's busy. Stay safe, keep well, and we'll see you next month.